Hello, I'm Kathy Kunz at Cool Choices, and I'm delighted you could join us today for our webinar on sustainable practices that add up. I'll start with a little bit of background and context and then leap into a discussion of practices. So as I said, I'm Kathy Kunz. I'm the Executive Director here at Cool Choices. My history is I've spent about 20 years in the traditional energy efficiency universe and really became obsessed with human behavior as the key to unlocking the savings we need to unlock, and for the last 7 years have been here at Cool Choices figuring out how to do that. And at Cool Choices, our quest is to really help businesses and communities accelerate their sustainability momentum by building bottom-up support from individuals and groups. And we do that through an online platform where we create customized programs where people join, they form teams, and they get credit for the sustainable practices they take over a period of 6 weeks or 8 weeks. They earn points, they earn bragging rights. Fundamentally, what we're doing is giving them a way to see that the people around them are sustainable too, and a reason to prompt some conversations that can really accelerate sustainability in bigger ways in those places. A lot of what we do in our program is talk about how small things add up. And that was really the impetus for today's webinar is staff saying to me, you know, it would be good to have some examples of what you mean when you say small things add up. So hence this webinar. And I think really for every sustainability professional, there's sort of this constant tension about, well, are you going to find that one big thing that blows all the goals out of the water, or is it really about small things? And we tend naturally, I think, to focus on the big thing, that maybe I'm going to find a project where implementing it will cut our total energy usage by 30% across the facility, or I'm going to find a technology that completely transforms the way our fleet operates and saves us millions of dollars a year. Something very kind of naturally compelling about where's that big thing. In reality, I know from all of my years in energy efficiency programs, really the way you build big savings is through small things. A terrific example is lighting, which is a small piece of the pie, but it's been tremendously important to the energy savings of any number of facilities, businesses, and even communities to implement more efficient lighting, even though lighting is a small percentage of your total usage, but it all adds up. It's that piece that small things really add up. So let's get into some very specific examples of this. And I want to start with a couple of examples in offices because office-based examples tend to apply to everyone. Everyone has some form of offices somewhere in their system. And relative to offices here, I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics that come from a study last year the Minnesota Department of Commerce Energy Group funded that was led by Seventh Wave, a nonprofit we collaborate with some. They do a lot of research around energy usage. And they did a study in Minnesota where they looked at workstation level energy usage across a number of facilities, and what they found was pretty amazing. Part of what they found is the average workstation they looked at used about 332 kilowatt hours a year. So it used roughly, you could say that's equivalent to a residential refrigerator. So as you look around your facility, maybe there's 50 workstations, maybe there's 2,500. That's the equivalent of that many refrigerators. So 50 refrigerators, 2,500 refrigerators, and it's really, okay, how can you squeeze some efficiency out of there? The other thing I want to point out to you in this picture as we talk about these efficiencies is we cleverly put this orange circle up here on purpose because one of the reasons that number is so big is because of this very thing. So part of what Seventh Wave saw in their research was that we increasingly have 2 monitors on desks, and very often both monitors are always on. They're getting bigger than they used to be, so there's a lot of electric usage there. The other kind of context thing I would add here is is part of what they saw, particularly in high-performance buildings, so buildings that are built to be very efficient relative to heating and cooling and lighting, is that these workstation plug loads could be 55% of the total electric usage of the building, which is just astonishing. Unless you look at more of the data. So this is data from the Energy Information Agency, and this is data about how electricity is used in all of the commercial buildings in the United States. So the 1995 and 2005 bars here are actual data, and then it was projections forward. So what you see here is over the course of time, EIA is saying, well, we're going to add more buildings to the grid, so the amount of HVAC used will kind of climb in a regular way. It's interesting. Look at lighting here for a second. Lighting is almost flat. What EIA is projecting there is we're going to add buildings, but lighting systems keep getting more efficient, so we're probably not going to spend a lot more on electricity for lighting in 2035 than we spent in 1995, given the trends. Of course, one part of this chart really stands out, and it's this piece over here on plug loads. So the current, the increase in plug loads between 1995 and 2005, plug load usage doubled. And EIA projects smaller increases but ongoing increases in plug load forward. So that's this piece we're talking about, these workstations. This is why these things matter. This becomes the dominant piece of the conversation about commercial buildings. And obviously it's spread out across all kinds of desks and particular personnel situations. So there's a different challenge there. But here you can clearly see how that usage adds up over time. So let's talk about a couple of the opportunities there. And the first opportunity is certainly tied to these dual monitors. Part of what Seventh Wave saw in their work is that by using computer power management settings, by turning off monitors when you're not using them, turning them off at night, you could save a range including 20% per workstation. That's a pretty significant saving. So again, if we think about that across a big facility, if you have 1,000 employees, if you can save 20% per workstation, that's the equivalent of unplugging 200 of those employees and them working without being plugged to the wall. Those are real numbers there in terms of how those savings add up across an organization. And again, that's really simple energy saving habits at that workstation level. It's mostly about hibernating or turning off computers at night, depending on what the protocol is in a particular organization, and then about turning off monitors when you're not using them, when you're away from your desk, etc. The other office opportunity that I always like to talk about is individual desk printers. So the National Renewable Energy Lab did a study where they looked at how many printers offices really need to function. And their analysis indicates that you can have 60 employees off a single printer and really function very effectively. So that's a bigger multi-stage kind of multi-function printer, but 1 to 60. As other folks looked at that number, they went, well, you know, but you've got people who are printing really sensitive things, and it's more complicated than that in our organization. So as a kind of rule of thumb, let's say 1 printer for every 15 people. So we'll add some printers back into the queue versus what NREL thought. What's really fascinating to me is, again, the Seventh Wave work in Minnesota. What they found was 1 printer for every 3 employees. So 5 times the number of printers that we think is kind of reasonable, and 20 times what NREL says is really possible to do there. So again, let's just do the math there. So suppose you have 120 employees and you fit that Minnesota profile. That means you've got 40 printers between the common area ones and the ones in people's offices. So if you went to a 1 printer per 15 staff, you'd have just 8 printers. You'd eliminate 32 printers. Now, a typical printer in somebody's office is not using huge amounts of electricity. It's using probably about 200 kilowatt hours a year. So, roughly $20. But you want to think about the other costs that you're incurring with those printers. You've got toner costs for each and every one of them, and probably with 32 printers, you probably have 15 different kinds of toner you're buying. And you've got the IT costs to support those printers. Know a number of IT professionals who talk about how printers are the bane of their existence because they can be so persnickety at times. So you've got all kinds of savings that add up here at that level of the printer, and how many of those printers you've got that aren't maybe being used very effectively. I want to talk about one more kind of big meta thing about offices before I give you a couple of other examples, and that's about the electric usage that happens in these offices when no one's working. So nights, weekends, and again, the 7th Wave study indicated that it's about 193 kilowatt hours per workstation. One of the interesting things they found was that workers who didn't shut off their computers and monitors at night were no more likely to shut them off over the weekend. So lots of stuff is task lights, whatever, running Friday at 5 till Monday at 9 a.m. Across 1,000 workstations, that's $28,000 a year. And again, that's kind of just money you're burning. Now, there's a little bit of electric usage that's inevitable at workstations, even when everything's appropriately turned off. There are some systems that are going to draw a little bit. There might be clocks. There might be other things that draw a tiny bit, but certainly they're not going to draw $28,000 a year. This is a thing that in other webinars we've talked about how sustainability teams can get more people to shut off their monitors and their computers appropriately at night. If you've listened to us before, you know I'm a big fan of bags of candy. So my favorite solution to this problem, because we believe everything is about positive reinforcement and generating buzz around the right behaviors, is to buy a bag of candy and come in early on a Monday morning and go around and leave candy for everyone whose monitors are off. No note, nothing, just candy. People are going to come in, they're going to chat about why Bill has candy and Tom does not. That's good. You want a little buzz. Probably 9:30 or 10, you send out an email just letting folks know, hey, props to everybody who remembered to turn off their monitors last week. I left some candy as thanks. Keep up the good work, guys. That very night, you'll have more monitors off. Now, you don't want to start giving out candy 2 days in a row, 4 days in a row, because then it's payment for service, and you're in a whole other complicated behavioral place. But occasionally, randomly rewarding people for doing the right thing is tremendously effective. There will be conversations over lunch that day about who had candy and who didn't, kind of thing. People might spontaneously remind each other to shut things off so that there's more likelihood that they'll both get candy in the future. And again, for $28,000 a year, you can buy a lot of candy. So really thinking about how these things add up across commercial buildings. I'm going to shift gears here now and talk a little bit about an industrial, a manufacturing example, and then we'll talk about fleet a little bit. And on the industrial side, I think the compelling small things add up example has to be compressed air. So lots of manufacturing facilities have compressed air systems, and a bane of every compressed air system is system leaks. So you've got all of these pipes moving this compressed air around the building, and potentially you've got some leaks. So if you have a leak in a quarter-inch system and you're running 3 shifts, that's about $4,000 a year, an average industrial electric rate. And anyone who's responsible for a compressed air system will tell you there's never just one leak. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting here to think about from a behavioral perspective is leaks in bigger pipes are more wasteful and more expensive than leaks in the smaller pipes. So a 1/32nd kind of orifice is going to have a smaller level of savings. That said, what ultimately you want is a place where people report all the leaks they see or hear proactively so that your sustainability team can fix those leaks in priority order. What you don't want is folks deciding, well, that leak isn't really worth fixing because it's only this much money. Because as soon as people start doing that, it becomes a really slippery slope. And today, I don't report this leak because it's not enough, and Bill sees that leak is never reported, and he thinks this other leak isn't worth reporting. And you start to create that situation where you're trying to deliver a compelling message about the organization's commitment to sustainability, and you've got team members looking around and going, there's leaks in our compressed air system everywhere that we're not fixing. Clearly, we're not that worried about sustainability. So you're creating this inconsistency that makes it really hard for people to get on board with your message. Really think about how do you create a system where you're encouraging people to identify all of the examples of waste and then addressing those in a prioritized kind of way that gives people confidence that all waste is important to minimize in the system. I want to close then with an example from the thing that maybe obsesses me most, which is vehicle idling. So lots of organizations have fleets of big trucks or medium-sized trucks. A good kind of rule of thumb here when you're talking about bigger tractor trailer kinds of things is an hour of idling is a gallon of gas. The thing that astonishes me in this is some of the data about how much idling is out there. So one study I saw from the state of Colorado talked about how average idling of vehicles could be 4 to 8 hours a day in some cases, which is going to cost $5,000 to $12,000 a year. The other important thing to know here is for newer diesel vehicles, there's actually an added maintenance cost for idling them. So there was a time, I said earlier that I've been in energy efficiency for 20 years. That means I'm old. So in my youth, you were taught to idle diesel vehicles because it was bad for them to shut off in the winter. Now, due to the new technologies in those engines, it's bad for them to idle without movement for long periods of time. So you actually end up with additional maintenance tied to those vehicles idling in place in addition to all the burned money as fuel there. So it's a place where this adds up a lot. And these numbers can, if you've got 50 vehicles and you're looking at $10,000 a year in idling costs, you're talking about $500,000. These numbers add up really fast. We interacted recently with a company that has been monitoring their vehicle idling, and they're talking about millions of dollars of idling every year that they're trying to reduce. And it's terrific that they've got their arms around that, but it is such a good example of how small things add up, because the guy in the truck today, the man or the woman in the truck, thinks it's not that big of a deal that they left it idling for 15 or 20 minutes. But across the entire fleet, across the entire year, it's a huge deal financially. It's also a huge deal in another way, and I want to close by, I talked a little bit about how employees can see those compressed air leaks and take that as a sign that the organization isn't very serious about sustainability. I think idling presents a particular challenge to organizations relative to their customers. Like it or not, our customers notice the things we do wrong more quickly than the things we do right. And kind of as context, there's evolutionary reasons for that. As human beings, there's an advantage to us if we see the dangerous things before we see the daisies out there in the world. So there's a really rational reason why we notice what someone did wrong before we maybe notice what they did right. It means the world's a little unfair. It means that if you've got a driver out there idling and 8 others who are not idling, some of your customers are going to notice that idling driver and think, man, they have money to burn. Why are those prices so high? You send people down a slippery slope where they're not as satisfied with your products and services because they're watching your staff waste money out there in the field. And I think idling is a particular place where companies have a risk of that because your vehicles are out there where everyone can see them. And so really thinking about, well, how do we do these things? How do we help people understand that the small things matter, both to save the money and also to protect our reputation out there? And certainly one of the ways we do this in our platform is we almost never talk about the incremental savings of an action. So earlier in the presentation, when I told you that getting rid of one printer would save $20 a year, that was a terrible thing to tell you. I only told you that because you're sustainability professionals and you can do the math in your head. Talking to a group of executives about that, I would say, so eliminating 300 printers from your facility will save you $20,000 a year, $2,000 a year, $20,000 a year. It'd be good if I did that math in advance. $20,000 a year. That's the number that's going to matter to them. So similarly, in our platform, we talk about things in aggregate. We talk about what all the things everyone is doing together are adding up to, not the individual incremental piece that one person is doing. Because when we talk about that at the individual level, it can be really hard to motivate action. But in aggregate, those numbers become a little bit more compelling. And again, it reinforces this idea that small things add up. Really think about in your own organization, where are those small opportunities that you can leverage to add up to bigger impacts? If everyone recycled appropriately, how big would that impact be? And thinking about how you talk about that big impact tied to this small act is a way to leverage some momentum in that area. And with that, I'm going to open things up to questions. So you've got that kind of GoToWebinar box on the side where you can type a question into the box and I can respond to it. Our aim with these webinars is to always keep them relatively short so that folks can get back to all of the other things they need to get done. I should let you know that we have a recording of the webinar and we will send that out to folks after the webinar so that if you want to review it again or you want someone else to watch it, you'll have that opportunity. So there's a question about skeptics, and this is tied to, I think, what I was saying there at the end. So what do you do about those people who say it's not worth it to turn off those lights, that's not saving that much energy anyway, it just doesn't matter? And, you know, in every organization, you've got some of those skeptics saying that. I think it's important to talk about the things I talked about here in terms of how seeing waste in one place creates a sense that it's okay to waste in other places. So those small acts that might seem it's not that big of a deal to leave my monitor on, multiplied across the entire organization become a bigger deal, but it also signals to folks that, well, if it's not that big of a deal for Mike to leave his monitor on, then it's maybe not that big of a deal for me to leave the data projector in the conference room on, and for someone else to leave something else on. And pretty soon you've got a really big deal, because it is a big deal in aggregate. So really thinking about how you help people walk through that, but those very visible things that we're doing or not doing signal to everyone around us what's important or not important, and that is a pretty fundamental piece of that. It looks like there are not other questions. So with that, I'm going to thank you again for joining me today. Hope this webinar was useful to you. Have a terrific rest of your day and keep advocating for sustainability. Thanks so much. Bye.